The air was thick with smoke and the acrid bite of melted metal. Red dust churned under broken boots and shattered armor, blanketing the battlefield in a muted haze as the twin suns of Erexus 9 bled into the horizon. Silence reigned where hours earlier death had danced to the roar of cannon fire and the shrieks of the dying. Only the occasional flicker of movement betrayed any lingering signs of life. Corporal Mason Reed stumbled over a broken plasma rifle embedded half-melted in the blackened earth. His breath rasped inside his cracked helmet, his suit system screaming low-power warnings he had long since learned to ignore. Orders barked through the comms, sharp and final. Retreat. Evac Point West Sector. Leave no one behind. No one but the enemy. And yet he paused. Out of the corner of his eye, half buried beneath debris and the twisted wreckage of what had once been a light skiff. He saw it. Movement. Not much. Just the faintest twitch, the barest flicker of life. Logic urged him on. Training demanded he follow orders. Compassion, that stubborn, battered thing lodged deep inside him, rooted him to the ground. Reed approached warily, hand resting on the battered sidearm at his hip. The form beneath the wreckage resolved itself into a figure, taller than him, even prone, armored in a suit of deep obsidian and etched silver, the design unlike anything human engineers had ever built. Blood, thick and dark as oil, slicked the ground around her. 2 jagged stumps where her legs should have been marked the brutal finality of her fate. She was an alien, one of the feared Zeratai warriors, a race humanity had battled for decades without ever truly understanding. Fierce, proud, relentless. Everything he had been taught told him she was the enemy. Everything he saw told him she was dying, abandoned by her own. Reed knelt slowly, one gloved hand hovering uncertainly over her battered body. Her breathing was shallow, raspy. The cracked edge of her helm revealed a glimpse of her face. Silver-toned skin smeared with blood and dirt, a jaw set in stubborn defiance, even unconscious. He should leave her. He had to leave her. Instead, he reached out, brushing the edge of her broken armor. At his touch, her eyes snapped open, startlingly bright, a luminous amethyst that seemed to burn into him. Instinctively, she tried to rise, but the motion ended in a ragged cry as agony tore through what remained of her legs. "Easy," Reed muttered, voice rough. She wouldn't understand the words, but maybe the tone would reach her where language failed. "I'm not here to hurt you." For a heartbeat they stare at one another. 2 soldiers from opposite ends of a war too vast for either to truly comprehend. In that heartbeat, Reed saw something unexpected. A flicker of fear buried beneath the rage of her gaze, a plea she likely didn't even realize she was making. He glanced back toward the horizon, where the last of his unit's transports were rising like dark insects into the bruised sky. If he stayed, he'd be cut off, left behind, branded a traitor. If he left her, she would die alone, forgotten even by her own kind. The choice shouldn't have been difficult. Yet Reed holstered his sidearm and slid his arms beneath her broken body. She struggled weakly, breath hissing past bared teeth, but she had no strength left to resist. Gently, carefully, he lifted her clear of the wreckage. The weight of her armor and the dead weight of her injuries nearly drove him to his knees. "Come on," he grunted, adjusting his grip. "You're not dying here. Not today." Each step away from the battlefield was a battle of its own. Every muscle in Reed's battered body screamed in protest. His lungs burned. Still, he moved, driven by something deeper than orders, something more primal than survival. The land around them was a wasteland of shattered craters and ruined machines. Once proud war engines lay broken and rusting. There remains a testament to futility of both sides' ambition. The sky wept ash. Even the wind seemed exhausted. Behind them, the first notes of the sanitization strike began to hum through the air. High, shrill, the sound of death sweeping the land clean of inconvenient remnants. Reed staggered toward a ruined outcrop. The skeletal remains of a once mighty tower, now reduced to jagged, leaning pillars. It offered scant cover, but it was better than nothing. Gently, he laid the alien down, propping her against a slab of broken stone. Her eyes flickered open again, dull with pain and fever. She spoke then, a guttural, broken whisper Reed didn't understand. The language of her people was sharp, clicking, layered with harmonics human throats couldn't mimic. But he didn't need a translator to understand the meaning behind the tone. Why? He shook his head slowly. You're still breathing. That's reason enough. She blinked, slow and disbelieving. Reed pulled a small medkit from his belt, the last one he carried. Without hesitation, he tore open the pack, applying field foam to her cauterized wounds. The foam hissed and hardened, staunching the slow bleed. She winced but did not cry out. Above them, the sky roared as the first wave of cleansing fire swept across the battlefield. Flames leapt in the distance, consuming everything in their path. Reed knew he should keep moving, but exhaustion pinned him beside her. For the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to simply be, to breathe, to exist beside another life without the need for violence. Her gaze never left him. Slowly, haltingly, she reached out one clawed hand, resting it lightly on his forearm. A gesture not of attack, but of acknowledgement, of trust, however fragile. In that moment, something shifted. The war, the bloodshed, the endless divisions, none of it mattered. Here, they were just two beings who refused to give up. Above them, the fires burned hotter. Closer, Reed gritted his teeth and forced himself upright. The alien, Sarai, he decided she deserved a name, gave a faint nod, as if understanding the resolve hardening in his face. He would not leave her, not to flames, not to the ghosts of a senseless war. Together, battered and broken, they would find a way to survive. And as Reed lifted her once more into his arms and turned toward the unknown ahead, he knew one thing with unshakable certainty. This was only the beginning. The night settled over the ruins like a suffocating shroud, the last embers of the day swallowed by a darkness so complete it seemed alive. Reed moved through the wreckage with slow, deliberate steps, the alien cradled against him. Her weight bore down heavier with every mile, every aching stride, but he refused to loosen his grip. Survival clung to the narrowest thread, and he had no intention of letting it snap. Above them, the sky pulsed with unnatural colors, the aftermath of the planet's endless bombardment. Strange, ghostly lights flickered at the edge of the blackness, like the spirits of the dead unwilling to leave. Every so often, distant thunder rolled, a grim reminder that the battlefield was not yet finished claiming lives. Reed's battered HUD flickered warnings in the corner of his vision. Radiation spikes, biological hazards, energy signatures unknown. None of it mattered. His entire world had shrunk to the next step, then the next, then the one after that. The alien stirred in his arms, a low groan escaping her cracked lips. Reed shifted his grip to ease her pain, whispering words of comfort she could not understand but perhaps could feel. The important things he had learned rarely needed translation. Ahead, a shadowed cleft in the landscape caught his eye, a crumbled bunker half buried by debris and overgrowth. Shelter, perhaps even safety. Without hesitation, Reed altered course, weaving through jagged spires of melted steel and slag until he reached the entrance. The bunker door hung askew, blasted from its hinges by some forgotten explosion. Reed slipped inside, his boots scuffing against scorched stone. The air was musty, thick with the scent of old fire and abandonment, but it was dry, and more importantly, hidden. Gently, he lowered the alien's Sarai onto a patch of relatively clean floor. She lay still, her chest rising and falling in shallow, fragile rhythms. Reed knelt beside her, stripping off his helmet with trembling hands. The air stung his face, raw and acrid, but he welcomed the burn. It meant he was still alive. From a pouch at his belt, he retrieved his last water ration. With careful fingers, he dribbled a few precious drops onto Sarai's cracked lips. She flinched at first, then drank greedily, a faint sound of gratitude rumbling from her throat. Her hand, cool and clawed, brushed against his wrist, anchoring him in place with surprising strength. Reed sat back on his heels, studying her. Even broken, she radiated a fierce, stubborn dignity. Her armor bore the marks of dozens of battles, scars not worn with pride, but simply carried, as a tree carries the lines of every storm survives. He wondered what her life had been before this war. Had she laughed once? Loved? Dreamed of something other than blood and conquest? The thought gnawed at him, unsettling in its quiet humanity. Sarai's eyes fluttered open again, hazy with pain. She said something, voice rough and broken. Reed shook his head helplessly. Language was a wall between them. But he would not let it be a prison. He tapped his chest with 2 fingers. "Reed," he said slowly, enunciating. Sarai blinked, her gaze sharpening slightly. After a long moment, she tapped her own chest, a harsh syllable escaping her lips. "Sarai." Reed smiled, a tight, weary thing. "Sarai," he repeated, testing the sound. It felt right somehow, a name heavy with history, with meaning he could not yet grasp. A low rumble shook the ground beneath them. Reed stiffened, hand going instinctively to his sidearm. He crept toward the bunker's entrance, peering out into the ruined landscape. Lights bobbed in the distance. Search drones. Their cold beams sliced through the darkness, methodically sweeping the wreckage. The enemy wasn't finished. They were hunting survivors, cleaning up what little resistance remained. Reed's mind raced. If the drones found them, there would be no mercy. Not for him. Certainly not for Sarai. He turned back, heart hammering in his chest. Sarai was trying to sit up, her face twisted in agony. She gestured weakly toward his belt, toward the beacon clipped there. Standard issue for field evac. He hesitated. Activating it would alert the drones immediately. But if he didn't, they had no way of signaling for help. His squad was gone. His command had likely written him off already. Another tremor rocked the ground. Closer this time. No time to argue. No time to weigh choices. Reed cursed under his breath and unclipped the beacon, smashing it against the ground to activate the emergency signal. A soft, steady pulse began to blink, silent but bright. Sarai sagged back with a sigh, her body trembling with the effort. Reed hurried to her side, checking the field dressings on her wounds. The foam had hardened well, but infection was a constant, gnawing threat. "You're stubborn," he muttered, half in admiration, half in despair. "You're going to make me fight the whole damn planet, aren't you?" A faint smile ghosted across her lips, a flicker of fierce amusement. Footsteps crunched outside. Heavy, deliberate. Reed's blood turned to ice. He drew his pistol, checking the magazine with swift, practiced motions. For rounds, for chances. A shadow loomed in the doorway. Without thinking, Reed stepped in front of Sarai, weapon raised. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear anything else. The first figure stepped into flickering light. Humanoid, armored in black with visors glowing a sickly green. Enemy, not drones. Hunters. They saw Reed and hesitated, surprised perhaps by the sight of a human defending an alien. Then they raised their weapons. The first shot cracked the air like a whip. Reed ducked, returning fire with desperate precision. The confined space amplified the noise into a deafening roar. The world narrowed to movement, to instinct. Reed dropped one attacker with a shot to the throat, pivoted to avoid a blade aimed at his side, fired again. Pain exploded across his ribs as another blow landed, knocking him sideways. He rolled, coming up hard against the wall. The third assailant advanced, weapon raised. Sarai moved. Despite her shattered body, she surged up with a ragged cry, grabbing a broken piece of rebar from the ground. She swung it with all her remaining strength, catching the hunter across the back of the head. The enemy crumpled. Reed didn't waste the opening. He fired the last 2 rounds into the final attacker, then collapsed against the wall, gasping. Smoke and blood filled the bunker. The enemy lay still. Reed's hands shook from adrenaline and pain. Sarai dragged herself toward him, her movements agonizingly slow. She pressed a clawed hand against his side, feeling the blood leaking from beneath his armor. Her expression darkened with anger, not at him, but at the situation, the senselessness of it all. Outside, the soft whine of engines drifted closer, the unmistakable sound of approaching dropships. Reed prayed they were friendly. He leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, Sarai was still watching him, her gaze sharp despite her exhaustion. Somehow, despite everything, they were still alive. And somehow he knew this bond they had forged in the crucible of fire and blood would not easily be broken. The dropships landed with a thunderous clatter, shaking the ground. Shouts echoed outside, the bark of orders, the clatter of boots. Reed allowed himself one last moment, one last heartbeat alone with the strange, fierce being who had refused to die. He didn't know what would happen next, whether he would be branded a traitor or a hero, whether Sarai would be seen as a prisoner or a symbol, whether this fragile connection between them could survive the harsh judgment of their worlds. But he knew one thing beyond all doubt. They had chosen each other, and that choice would change everything. The dropships disgorged squads of armored figures into the ruins, their weapons raised and scanning. Reed barely managed to lift his hand in a weak, faltering way before blackness clawed at the edges of his vision. Shouts echoed in the alien night, distorted and fragmented to the ringing in his ears. He felt hands gripping him, pulling him away from the cold stone. Instinct made him fight, struggling weakly, but a voice, sharp human, broke through the haze. Marine down. Get him stabilized. And what the hell is that thing? Reed tried to speak, to explain, but his throat was raw, his strength spent. All he could do was reach back, his fingers brushing empty air where Sarai had been. Rough hands pinned him to a stretcher as a medic worked frantically to stem the bleeding at his side. Through the confusion, Reed caught glimpses of Sarai, half conscious, bound in thick magnetic cuffs, surrounded by wary soldiers with their rifles trained tight. She didn't resist. She barely moved. The ship's engines screamed as they lifted from the ruins, the battlefield shrinking away beneath them into a blur of blood and ash. Reed's eyes locked onto Sarai's across the cargo bay. Two souls ripped from the wreckage of war, clinging to something they didn't yet have words for. Hours bled together as the dropship thundered across the broken lands, finally delivering them to the forward operating base nestled in a jagged valley. Reed was pulled from the stretcher and rushed into a medical bay, the bright sterile light stabbing at his retinas. He tried to turn his head, to see where they were taking her, but a heavy sedative dragged him under before he could even form the thought. When he woke, the world was different. The pain was a dull throb now, bandaged and muted by drugs. His armor had been stripped away, replaced by a rough medical gown. For a line snaked from his arm, monitors beeped quietly at his bedside. A grizzled officer with a face carved by 1,000 hard decisions stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Corporal Mason Reed, the officer said, voice low and controlled. You got a lot of people asking questions. Reed's throat was dry, his mind sluggish. Sarai, he rasped before anything else. The officer's brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion passing through his stone-carved demeanor. The alien? She's in containment. Alive for now, thanks to you. Relief flooded Reed, mingled with dread. He didn't trust the tone in the man's voice. You disobeyed direct orders, the officer continued, stepping closer. You jeopardized your unit. You aided an enemy combatant. Reed forced himself upright, biting down the pain that flared along his side. She wasn't a threat. She was dying. That wasn't your decision to make. The officer's tone hardened, like a door slamming shut. Command wants answers. They want to know if you were compromised, coerced. They want to know if you're still fit for duty. I made a choice, Reed said, his voice gaining strength. I chose to save a life. The officer regarded him for a long moment, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out, the door hissing shut behind him. Reed sagged back against the bed, fury and fear warring within him. He needed to see her. He needed to make sure she was safe. But for the first time since the war began, he realized he might no longer be a soldier, and the uniform he had bled for might no longer stand beside him. Days crawled past, each one stretching like a prison sentence. They kept him isolated, under observation. Tests, interrogations, psychological evaluations. Every answer he gave seemed to weigh him down further, as if the truth itself was a crime. He learned fragments through whispered conversations and eavesdrop comms. Sarai was being held in a secured medical wing, treated like a dangerous experiment. They didn't see her as a person. They saw her as a trophy, a tool. Reed's anger became a living thing inside him, clawing at the walls of his chest. Late one night, the door to his room hissed open. A woman entered, her uniform crisp, her rank insignia gleaming. Colonel Adrian Voss. Reed recognized her immediately. Head of intelligence. A legend and a nightmare in equal measure. She didn't waste time. Corporal Reed, I have a proposition for you. He sat up slowly, wary. Voss smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You've demonstrated unusual initiative, she said, pacing the room, and you've built an unprecedented rapport with our guest. Command believes you might be uniquely suited to assist in our efforts. What efforts? Reed asked, though he suspected he already knew. Understanding her, learning her weaknesses, exploiting them. Voss stopped, facing him fully. In exchange, you avoid court-martial. You keep your rank. You get your life back. Reed stared at her, disgust simmering beneath his skin. They didn't want peace. They didn't want understanding. They wanted leverage. And if I refuse, he asked, voice low. Voss's smile sharpened. Then you're stripped of rank, imprisoned for aiding the enemy, and forgotten. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Reed nodded. I'll do it. Voss's eyes glinted with satisfaction. Good. Your first session begins tomorrow. She left without another word. Reed sat in the sterile silence, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. He knew the game they were playing. He knew he was a pawn. But if that was the only way to get to Sarai, then so be it. The next morning, they escorted him through a labyrinth of security checkpoints to a small, sterile room. Walls lined with reinforced glass. In the center, seated in a chair bolted to the floor, was Sarai. She looked smaller somehow, thinner. Her new prosthetic legs, rough, utilitarian constructs, gleamed dully in the harsh light. Cuffs still bound her wrists, though she made no move to resist. Her head lifted as Reed entered, and for a heartbeat, something like hope flickered in her luminous eyes. He sat across from her, forcing himself to meet her gaze, to hide the rage boiling inside him. They weren't enemies anymore. They were survivors, prisoners of a war that cared nothing for mercy. He didn't know how much of his words she would understand, but he spoke anyway. I'm sorry, he said softly. I'm here. I won't let them break you. Sarai tilted her head, studying him. She said something, a soft, broken phrase he didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. Gratitude, trust. Reed felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement deep in his soul. He would play their game. He would nod and smile and pretend to be their willing puppet. And when the time came, he would tear down every wall they had built between them. He would not fail her. Not again. The door behind him hissed open, and Colonel Voss's voice crackled through the intercom. Begin session 1. Reed leaned forward, speaking low and steady. Not to interrogate, but to reach across the chasm between them. What's your real name? He asked. Sarai blinked slowly, then, after a moment, tapped her chest again. But this time, she added something, another word, softer, older, not the name of a soldier, the name of a soul. Reed smiled faintly. He would learn it. He would learn everything. And together, they would find a way out. Reed's first steps into the interrogation chamber felt heavier than the gravity pressing down on his battered body. The room was bare, its sterile walls gleaming under cold, clinical lights. In the center sat Sarai, her posture slumped but her gaze sharp, wary. Thick cuffs bound her wrist to the chair's arms, but her spirit, unmistakably, remained untethered. The guards posted at the door stiffened as Reed entered, their hands twitching near their weapons, mistrust thick in the stale air. Reed ignored them, crossing the threshold with deliberate calm, meeting Sarai's gaze without hesitation. He saw the flash of recognition in her eyes, quickly masked behind the practiced stoicism of a warrior trained not to betray weakness. The first moments passed in silence, thick and taut like a tripwire strung between them. Reed lowered himself into the metal chair facing her, the scrape of its legs against the floor scraping his already frayed nerves. He wanted to speak immediately, to offer reassurance, but he forced himself to wait. The first move had to be hers, if there was to be trust between them again. Sarai shifted slightly. The metallic hiss of her prosthetic legs faint beneath the hum of the overhead lights. They were crude, temporary replacements, slapped together with the efficiency of engineers who viewed her survival as an inconvenience rather than a miracle. She bore them with the same grim endurance with which she carried every other scar. Reed cleared his throat quietly. "Sarai." Her chin lifted, a flicker of acknowledgement flashing across her face. "It was enough. They think I'm here to interrogate you." He kept his voice low, non-threatening. "But I'm not." Sarai tilted her head, the motion almost feline, measuring him. Her lips parted slightly, a guttural word spilling forth. He didn't understand the language, but the emotion behind it, sharp, skeptical, needed no translation. "I know you don't trust me." Reed leaned forward, careful to keep his movements slow, deliberate. "But I trust you. I need you to trust me too." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then slowly, she looked down at her bound wrists, then back at him, her eyes hard and shining with bitter humor. Reed smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "Yeah, I get it. Actions, not words." Behind the mirror glass, unseen but definitely present, Reed could feel the watcher studying them, recording every breath, every glance. His job, officially, was to extract information, to break through her defenses. Instead, he planned to build something far more dangerous: loyalty. He leaned back slightly in his chair, adopting a posture of relaxation, of equality. "Tell me about your world," he said, voice soft, almost coaxing. "What was it like before the war?" Sarai's eyes narrowed. "A test, a trap, or so she would assume." "I don't care about strategies or command structures," Reed added quickly. "I want to know you, not the soldier, the person." Still, silence stretched in between them. Then, slowly, Sarai inhaled. When she spoke, her words came haltingly, strained to the barriers of language and exhaustion. He caught fragments, pieces. A world with crimson seas and forests that glowed at night, mountains that sang when the wind caught their crystal faces, a people who danced and fought and loved with equal ferocity. Reed listened, enraptured. He pictured it all, letting her words paint images across the sterile walls of their prison. When she faltered, he encouraged her with small nods, murmured affirmations. He did not press for details about her military past. He did not seek the weaknesses his superiors craved. Instead, he sought her heart. Little by little, Sarai's posture eased. Her shoulders relaxed. Her voice grew steadier. She spoke of family. Though the exact word eluded him, the ache in her voice was unmistakable. Of comrades, of traditions older than memory. Reed realized with sudden, sharp clarity how much his own kind had never tried to understand the Zeratai. They had seen monsters, not people. They had made enemies of potential brothers and sisters, driven by fear and ignorance. The session ended not with confrontation, but a moment of fragile, aching quiet. When the guards came to escort her back to her cell, Sarai did not resist. But as she passed Reed, she paused. For a heartbeat, they stood side by side. In that sliver of time, she brushed her clawed fingers lightly against his sleeve, a fleeting touch, almost accidental. A connection forged not by command or coercion, but by choice. Reed watched her go, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew the watchers behind the glass would misinterpret the moment. Let them. Their misunderstanding would be his shield. He was playing a dangerous game, but it was one worth the risk. Back in his quarters, Reed spent the long hours dissecting every word, every expression from their encounter. He recorded nothing in the official logs, offering instead a bland, sanitized version of events. Useful but false. His loyalty was no longer to the command structure that had abandoned compassion. It was to the woman he had carried from the ashes, who had fought beside him even when her body was broken. Days blurred together in a monotonous parade of sessions. Each time, Sarai revealed a little more. Not secrets of war, but glimpses of herself. In return, Reed shared fragments of his own life. A childhood spent chasing storms across barren plains. A brother lost conscription. The hollow victories he'd been ordered to claim. Their exchanges built an invisible bridge between them, a language of shared suffering and stubborn hope. But even as they built their fragile connection, the noose tightened around them. Colonel Voss grew impatient. Reed saw it in the clipped tones of her debriefings, the sharp glint in her eyes. She wanted results, not rapport. She wanted something she could use, something to validate the machinery of war grinding ceaselessly forward. Reed knew it was only a matter of time before she decided he was more liability than asset. One evening, after yet another session laced with hidden meaning and half-spoken promises, Reed was summoned not to the briefing room, but to the command center itself. Voss stood before a massive holodeck displaying schematics Reed didn't recognize, new weapons, new strategies. Among them, highlighted in ominous red, was a crude rendering of Sarai's biology. Weak points, exploitable vulnerabilities. "You've done well, Corporal," Voss said, her voice syrupy with false warmth. "Better than we expected. But it's time to move to the next phase." Reed's stomach churned. "What phase?" Voss smiled thin and sharp. "Asset extraction. Direct interrogation. We've learned what we can through diplomacy. Now we extract the rest by force." The words hit him like a blow. "She's not a thing," he said, barely managing to keep his voice steady. "She's not an asset." Voss's smile faded, replaced by cold contempt. "She's an enemy, nothing more." Reed's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He saw the trap unfolding around him, saw the shadow of the future Voss intended. Sarai broken, betrayed, reduced to nothing more than a tool for their war. Not if he could help it. "Understood, ma'am," he said, forcing the words past his teeth. Voss nodded approvingly. "Good. You'll assist in the extraction personally. Tomorrow." Dismissed, Reed stumbled from the command center, his mind racing. He had less than 24 hours. 24 hours to plan the impossible, to save them both, to escape a war that devoured everything good and pure and left only ashes behind. As he lay awake that night, staring at the cracked ceiling of his cell, Reed made his decision. He would not be a pawn any longer. He would not be complicit in the destruction of something precious. When morning came, he would not walk into that interrogation room to assist. He would walk in to set her free. And together, against every blade turned against them, they would fight. The morning came heavy with expectation. The sky outside the base a pale smear of colorless light, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Reed dressed in silence, strapping on the black tactical uniform they had issued him, each movement slow, deliberate, every buckle. Every fastening felt like a betrayal he refused to accept, a uniform that no longer fit the man he had become. He tucked a small utility blade into his boot, hidden where even the most thorough search would miss it. Not much of a weapon, but it wasn't intended for a fight. It was intended for freedom. The corridors leading to containment wings stretched long and cold, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Reed walked them with steady strides, heart hammering against his ribs. He had memorized the patrol rotations, the blind spots in the cameras, the shift changes that left security thin for just a few precious minutes. He had one chance. At the final checkpoint, the guards barely glanced at him. They knew him by now. The Marine who had somehow cracked the alien's armor, who had turned a savage enemy into a compliant informant. That was the story Voss had spun, and they believed it because it was easier than facing the truth. He stepped through the final door and into the sterile confines of Sarai's cell. She sat where she always did, her hands shackled to the chair, the dim lights carving sharp planes into her silvered skin. Her prosthetics rested heavily against the floor, mechanical joints stiff and worn. Yet her eyes, when they lifted to meet his, were fierce with recognition. Reed crossed the room without hesitation, crouching low so he was eye level with her. The cameras watched, but they would see only what he let them. "This is it," he whispered, barely moving his lips. Sarai's gaze sharpened. She shifted slightly, the faintest nod. Reed slipped the utility blade from his boot, palming it with practiced ease. With one hand, he leaned forward as if adjusting her restraints for the coming extraction. With the other, he sliced through the magnetic cuffs in 2 quick, decisive motions. The bonds fell away with a soft clatter. Instantly, Sarai's hands were free. She moved without hesitation. Her fingers curling around the blade, he pressed into her palm. A weapon was a language they both spoke fluently. Reed straightened, offering her his hand. For a breathless moment, she stared at it, the simplest gesture of trust. Then she clasped his forearm, and he hauled her to her feet. The plan was simple. Simple didn't mean easy. They moved quickly, Reed leading the way through the maintenance access corridors he had scouted days before. Every step was a risk, every corner a potential end. Twice they had to duck into service alcoves as patrols passed by, Sarai pressing close against him, her breathing shallow but steady. The prosthetics slowed her, but not enough to matter. She adapted with the ruthless efficiency of a true warrior, her movements gaining confidence with every stride. When they reached the outer perimeter, Reed activated the stolen access codes he had memorized, the door hissing open with mechanical sigh. The cold slap of outside air rushed in, sharp and invigorating. Alarms had not yet sounded. They had minutes, maybe less. The perimeter wall loomed ahead, lined with razor wire and gun emplacements. Beyond it, the shattered wilderness stretched into shadowed freedom. "Cover me," Reed muttered. He sprinted toward the first watchtower, Sarai right behind him. The guards stationed there never saw them coming. Reed hit the first with a brutal elbow to the throat, dropping him soundlessly. Sarai dispatched the second with a swift, efficient slash of her blade, her movements a terrifying blur of precision. No time to linger, no time to hesitate. They climbed the tower, Reed disabling the automated defenses as Sarai hacked into the comm system, looping the camera feeds for precious additional seconds. Then they ran, across open ground, through the deafening silence of the kill zone. The sound of their boots pounding the frozen earth was the loudest thing Reed had ever heard. A shout split the air behind them. The first alarm blared a moment later, the klaxon shrieking through the base like a wounded animal. Gunfire cracked in the distance. They didn't look back. The razor wire loomed ahead. Reed boosted Sarai upward, her clawed hands catching the fencing, slicing through it with the stolen blade. He followed, blood blooming across his palms as the wire bit deep. Pain didn't matter. Only movement mattered. They dropped to the other side, rolling hard. Sarai came up first, hauling Reed to his feet with a strength that defied her battered frame. Spotlights swept across the field, hunting them. The world exploded into noise and chaos behind them. Shouts, the bark of orders, the distant whine of pursuit drones lifting into the sky. Still they ran, into the broken landscape where war had once raged, leaving only scars and secrets behind. The shattered ruins offered cover, and they used it ruthlessly, weaving through the wreckage with the desperation of the condemned. Hours blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and adrenaline. When they finally paused, it was in the hollow of a collapsed bunker, hidden from view beneath twisted steel beams and shattered stone. Reed collapsed against the wall, his breath sawing in and out of his lungs. Sarai knelt beside him, inspecting the blood oozing from his torn hands. Without a word, she tore strips from the ragged remains of her own clothing, binding his wounds with surprising gentleness. Reed watched her, a lump forming in his throat. He had saved her once. Now, she was saving him. The irony wasn't lost on him. "You didn't have to come," he rasped when he could finally speak. Sarai met his gaze, her expression fierce. She tapped her chest, then pressed her palm against the ground between them. Together, Reed understood. Not prisoner and rescuer, not human and alien. Simply together. A team forged in blood and betrayal and impossible hope. The distant sound of pursuit faded as the hours dragged on. The hunters would not give up easily, but Reed knew they had gained enough distance to make tracking them harder. Night fell again, wrapping the ruins in cold silence. They built a small fire from scavenged debris, careful to shield the light. As the flames flickered, casting dancing shadows across the broken walls, Reed and Sarai sat side by side. No words passed between them. None were needed. The bond they had forged in silence, and suffering spoke louder than language ever could. Reed stared into the fire, thinking of everything they had left behind. The betrayal, the cruelty, the blind hatred masquerading as loyalty. He didn't know what future lay ahead for them, whether they would find peace or simply more battles to fight. But for the first time in years, he felt something stirring in his chest that he had thought long dead. Hope. Real, stubborn, reckless hope. He looked over at Sarai, her profile limned in firelight, her eyes reflecting the embers like twin stars. "We'll find a way," he said quietly. Sarai turned to him, and for the first time a real smile touched her lips. Small, fragile, but undeniably real. They had been enemies. They had been prisoners. Now they were something new, something stronger. Two warriors who had chosen each other against every order, every instinct, every law. Not because they had to,